educational linguist. Um, uh, he has written several books and journal articles. Some of them include Language, Power and Pedagogy, Negotiating Identities, Bilingual Education and Social Change, Empowering Minority Students. He has also edited few volumes with others. Some of them are Literacy, Language, Technology and Diversity, Identity Text, the Collaborative Creation of Power in Multilingual Schools. He has also edited the Handbook of Bilingual and Multilingual Education with Ophelia Garcia. Professor Ajit Mohanty is equally a distinguished scholar from India. He's a psychologist, a psycholinguist, and an educationist at the same time, and is renowned for his work on multilingualism, language policy, and the education of marginalized communities, particularly in South Asia. A former professor of psychology and chairperson at Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Mohanty co-founded the National Multilingual Education Resource Consortium, NMRC, with support from UNICEF India. He actually has dedicated his career to exploring the intersections of language, culture, and education in multilingual societies. Is known for some of the concepts like double divide and mother tongue-based multilingual education. And some of his very popular books are Multilingual Education for Social Justice, Globalizing the Local, which was co-edited by a few other scholars, including me. The Multilingual Reality, Living with Languages, which actually came out very recently in 2019. Professor Mohanty and Professor Jim Cummins are two very strong voices for language rights as human rights as well. Both Professor Mohanty and Professor Cummins have profound impact on language education policy and multilingual education practices globally, especially in the context of linguistic diversity, migration, and social equity in schooling. I invite you both to this dialogue. Before we start this dialogue, I request Dr. Huma Masood to briefly talk about the State of Education Report 2025, which is for this year on multilingual education and mother tongue. Dr. Huma, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Minati.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
First of all, thanks a lot to Dr. Minati Panda for organizing and hosting these dialogues. And it's a privilege and a very proud moment for all of us that we have Dr. Cummins and Dr. Mohanty for this particular discussion. And we are really honored and grateful for them to be giving their precious time to this discussion. I'm sure that all of us will benefit from their expertise, and this and also we'll be able to really have a good report based on the inputs and expertise which will be shared by both Dr. Cummins and Dr. Mohanty. The 2025 State of the Education Report for India is on multilingualism and mother tongue education. The UNESCO Regional Office for South Asia has actually produced a series of annual reports for India on national education issues as knowledge materials to strengthen the Indian education system and creating and developing evidence-based education policies. We have developed almost 6 State of the Education reports for India, what we call SOER. And the topics or themes which we have covered since 2019 have had the focus on the right of education for children with disabilities, technical and vocational education and training, teachers and professional development, artificial intelligence and education, education to address climate change, and the last year one was on culture and arts in education. As I mentioned earlier, that this year in 2025, we are developing a report on State of the Education report on multilingual education and mother tongue based education. So what we are looking at is, since we have the experts with us, so I'm not going to, go into what we mean by mother tongue based instructions or bilingual or multilingual education, but I'll just like to highlight very briefly because we want to hear the experts. So this report, what we are looking at is May and hopefully we look at, since we have worked on a chapterization already, so we are thinking of that this report will be able to analyze the existing laws, policies, frameworks, and practices and initiatives, both at the national, state, and local level. We would also be looking at significant barriers and challenges in accessing quality education in mother tongue based and multilingual languages, and evidences we want to collect on the cognitive, social, and economic benefits of mother tongue and multilingual education at the school and until the entire education process. We also are looking at policy recommendations to strengthen curriculum, teaching and learning materials through integration, development and alignment of assessments in mother tongue and multilingual education. We would also be looking and researching on guidelines and recommendations for continuous professional development of teachers, and also how do we enhance pedagogical approaches to ensure quality pre and in-service teacher training. The document will also look at varied multilingual learning environments which exist, the facilities and spaces which are available, all at national and different state and regional levels. And we would like to collect successful evidences of social interactions, social and emotional well-being, and inclusive learning methodologies. We are also looking at how do we introduce integration and access to, and also research on digital resources and traditional and modern teaching methods, including combining indigenous pedagogical practices like storytelling and experiential learning with contemporary approaches such as using the community radios, digital tools, e-books in the indigenous, minority, and migrant languages. We would also try to rationalize that how mother tongue and multilingual education can bolster also and lead children and students towards higher education, how the environmental concerns are energized, how employment opportunities and decent work prevails through the support of mother tongue and multilingual education. We would also like to secure and collect how cultural practices, use of art and culture is in or is one of the practices to enhance mother tongue based education and multilingualism. And in that context, we would also look at the declining languages of the tribal and Northeast regions and how these could be enhanced or have been enhanced. So we'll try to collect case studies from different regions of India to really bring out a good report which will be able or which will enable and enhance the current policy on NEP 2020. We are trying to also find, the right and rare solutions, what has worked, what has not worked in the system. And therefore, it's important to have accurate references, attributions, and all the information and materials in this report so that we are able to bring out good, constructive, substantive, rich recommendations through this particular report. I do not want to go into much of the objectives and all the details and methodology because we already have a concept note and this could be shared by the experts. So with this, I once again welcome the experts, Dr. Cummins and Dr. Mohanty, and also all the people who have participated today in this discussion. Now, over to you, Minati. And with this, I close and look forward to hearing from the experts. Thank you.
Yes. So we will proceed with the dialogue now, as discussed with Professor Mohanty and Professor Cummins. I think Professor Cummins will begin the dialogue. Professor Cummins, maybe for 35 to 40 minutes, followed by Professor Mohanty, who will also be responding to some of the issues that Professor Cummins raises in his talk and bring his own ideas as well to the dialogue. He'll also take another 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the session to others for dialogue, say around for 30 minutes. So I think that's fine with all of you. 2 hours basically we require. So over to you, Professor Cummins.
Okay, thank you, Minati, and thank you for the invitation to be here and be part of this dialogue. It's a real privilege, and I also very much appreciate the opportunity to be on a panel with my good friend, Professor Ajit Mohanty. We go back a long way. We met for the first time at the University of Alberta in the 1970s, and it's good to know that we're both still around, still talking, still involved in the issues. And again, it's a very much a pleasure and a privilege to be able to participate in this dialogue. So let me just pause for a moment to share my screen, and we can get going. Okay. Okay, so you see two images on the screen, and they both actually you see four, but the two images at the bottom are the ones I want to focus on because they encapsulate two of the major themes that I want to try and highlight in my presentation this morning. The first comes from a grade 5 classroom in the Toronto area. It was a classroom that was participating in a project that Professor Margaret Earley of University of British Columbia and I had about 20 years ago it started. But it looked at ways in which teachers and schools could include and address the linguistic diversity that's characteristic of large cities such as Toronto and Vancouver, where more than 50% of the students come from non-English speaking backgrounds. And at the time of our project, the prevailing wisdom was that, well, you know, we have a mini United Nations in our classroom. The teacher may be bilingual, may speak other languages, but she probably doesn't speak even a fraction of the range of languages that are in typical classrooms. So the default option is just to use English. And what our project explored in both Vancouver and Toronto was how teachers could use their creativity to incorporate the languages of students in the school context. So rather than the message coming to students that they should leave their languages at the schoolhouse door because they just didn't fit in the school, which was an English-only zone, the message to students was that their languages are valuable, their home languages are part of their identity, part of the intellectual accomplishments that they're bringing into the school, and we should be proactive in our instruction in communicating the message that bilingualism and multilingualism are valuable attributes. They've always been part of educated people's mental repertoire. And the poster that you see, all our languages in our school, is from one classroom where the teacher, who actually was from India, and spoke about 6 different languages, opened up about her language learning experiences and in terms of learning and maintaining a variety of different languages in different contexts. And that opened up the door for students to talk about their languages and to feel proud about their languages and write stories in their languages as well as in English. And classrooms like this the students produced a lot of dual language books written in both English and their home languages. And the impact on students' identities, on their sense of knowledge about languages, their metalinguistic awareness was quite profound. The other theme that I want to highlight in my presentation is the fact that even though the oral language, the conversational, everyday language that children bring to school is important, it's an attribute of who we are as a human species. It only takes us so far in terms of schooling. As we go up through the grades, typically the curriculum becomes more complex. The language in which curriculum topics are expressed becomes more complex, and the language of books, the language of academic contexts, goes beyond the language of everyday communication. And it's critical that students become socialized into literacy, see books and reading as something that is pleasurable. And this would include the oral storytelling of various communities that may not be written down, but is still a form of literacy that takes students out of the here and now and into the realm of imagination and extending their identities, their lives, their knowledge of the world. So those are 2 themes that I want to highlight in the next half hour or so. Before getting into those topics, I'd like to just acknowledge the work of Dr. Tova Skutnik-Kangas, who obviously is well known in the Indian subcontinent as somebody who has had an immense impact on mother tongue-based multilingual education in that continent as well as internationally. She's a friend, mentor, and tireless advocate for international human rights who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. This is a picture of Tova in our house with our eldest son, Stephen, reading a book to him. I just want to acknowledge Tova's influence on my own work, as well as the impact that she has had internationally. So I've got basically 2 parts of the presentation. The first part, I want to look at what is the research saying. If we take a wide lens approach to the research that's out there, looking at it internationally, what can we say with confidence in terms of the development of bilingual and multilingual skills, and what kinds of educational context and instructional approaches will most effectively develop students' skills, not just in the primary language or the dominant language of the society, but also in their home languages. So I want to try and sum up some of the major themes that come out of 50 plus years of research on mother tongue-based bilingual education and the theoretical principles that emerge from that research. Now, theoretical principles are important because those are the generalizations that we can make based on the research that's coming from multiple contexts. And so the approach that I'm going to take, which is one that reflects my own work, is an approach that looks at what we can tell from research that's been carried out in North America, South America, Europe, Asian contexts, rather than focusing specifically on the Indian context. Obviously, most of the people who are involved in this meeting have much more expertise in interpreting and knowledge about the research that's happened in the Indian context. So if we look at the first point, and that's the fact that using 2 or more languages is good for your brain. There is a huge amount of research at this point in time that bilingualism is not some kind of impediment that we need to protect children from. And that may seem like an absurd statement to make, but that was the understanding up until the 1960s in countries like the UK when it came to Welsh English bilingualism, in many parts of Europe, in many parts of North America, where it was quite common. Hello, is maybe if there's somebody who is speaking, maybe you can turn off your microphone. I'm not sure if that was a message for me or not, but um, anyway, what I was saying is that there's a huge amount of research showing that bilingualism increases children's knowledge about languages. It increases their sense of sense. It expands their identity in terms of the cultures that they can participate in, and many other findings. There's a really enlightening and short video that the British Broadcasting Corporation produced, and you see the link to it down below. It's about 2.5 minutes long, and it's something that I think teachers and students could watch and appreciate the fact that as bilinguals, as multilinguals, they have an inherent advantage in many respects. I've just sorry, Mary, is there somebody? I'm not sure if somebody's trying to communicate with me. Can you hear me okay? Okay, there's I've just pulled out one out of these hundreds of studies to just illustrate the findings. This is a study that was published in 2009, where the researchers looked at students who were English and Mandarin bilinguals and English Spanish bilinguals who'd learned both languages prior to school, and they compared these to monolingual English speakers and how well they mastered words in an invented language that bore no resemblance to English, Spanish, or Mandarin. The bilingual participants, they found, mastered nearly twice the number of words as the monolinguals. So knowing another language increases one's ability to acquire additional languages. So they're more adept at learning a new language than monolingual children. And their bilingual advantage persists even when the new language they study is completely different from the languages they already know. So it's the experience of becoming bilingual itself that makes learning a new language easier. As I said, this is just one of hundreds of studies that have been carried out over the last 50 years that point in this direction. And obviously, Professor Mohanty and his colleagues have carried out really pioneering research in the Indian context and tribal contexts, pointing in exactly the same direction. So this is not something that is disputed anymore. It is established that knowledge of other languages, particularly when these languages continue to develop throughout schooling, can be a major advantage for children. If we look at the research on bilingual education programs, and this would include mother tongue-based multilingual programs, and look at what the research is saying about these programs compared to monolingual English programs when we look at children who are coming to school speaking a language other than the dominant language. Again, I'm just going to pull out one study out of the many studies that have been carried out on this over the last 30 years, 40 years. And this was a study carried out by two researchers in California, Valentino and Reardon, where they looked at the effectiveness of 4 instructional programs that were designed to serve students who were learning English as an additional language. And the basic conclusion you see over on the left in the headline of an article on this study: students learning English benefit more in 2 language instructional programs than in English-only programs. And this is research carried out by researchers in Stanford University. And there's a quotation there that says the by ethnicity results suggest that Latino English learners, in other words, Spanish-speaking English learners, perform the best in both English language arts and mathematics in the long term when they're enrolled in any of the bilingual programs, but especially have the most optimal long-term outcomes in dual immersion programs. And these programs continue instruction in both languages, at least throughout elementary school. By 7th grade, Latino students in the dual immersion and transitional bilingual programs showed much higher English language arts performance than those who'd received all of their instruction through English. Now, this may seem paradoxical, in these students who had at least 50% of instruction through Spanish, and in other words, 50% less instruction through English, were doing better over the long term than similar children who had all of their instruction through English. How do we explain that? And the way we explain it is because there's transfer across languages, and students are developing a foundation, a conceptual foundation in their home languages that they're bringing to school that facilitates their learning of the dominant school language. There's a wonderful UNESCO report that came out this year called Languages Matter, Global Guidance on Multilingual Education. And this report sums up a lot of the international research that looks at mother tongue-based multilingual education. And there's a couple of quotes up there, but basically it says mother tongue multilingual mother tongue-based education is recognized not only for enhancing bilingualism and fostering inclusive classrooms, but also for protecting endangered languages, strengthening social cohesion, stimulating linguistic growth, and contributing to sustainable development. As part of the broader transformation of educational systems, MLE supports linguistically marginalized learners while benefiting the entire educational landscape and societies at large. And they highlight three principles of MLE that emphasize the importance of, first of all, mother tongue instruction to enhance educational quality by leveraging the knowledge and experiences of both learners and teachers. Bilingual and/or multilingual education at all educational levels to promote social and gender equality and to support the fabric of linguistically diverse society. And then language is a key component of intercultural education, fostering understanding among different population groups and ensuring respect for fundamental rights. And these are not just principles that they've picked out of the air. This is exactly what the research that they summarize is pointing towards, and not just research that they summarize, but the broader research landscape that I've also talked about. Just to, again, give you a sense of the empirical evidence associated with the conclusions that this UNESCO report draws. One of them that is very persuasive, it's an extremely well-designed study carried out in Kenya. And this is a box that's in the report that's entitled Mother Tongue-Based Education Improves Early Grade Reading in Kenya. And this is a randomized controlled trial. In other words, it has the highest level of scientific credibility. Demonstrated that a mother tongue-based program significantly improved early grade reading skills among children. I'm not going to go into the actual details. You can read that for yourselves. You will have access to the PowerPoint afterwards. But there's also on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a findings from a study carried out in India. And again, I'll let you read that yourselves. But the conclusion there at the bottom is early assessments showed marked improvement in learning outcomes directly attributed to learning to read in the mother tongue rather than in an unfamiliar language. And they point out that literacy skills acquired through students' mother tongues transfer to additional languages, facilitating the transition to multilingual learning. Now, again, this is not a conclusion that they've pulled out of the air. This is the conclusion that we can draw from more than 50 years of research on these issues. And again, looking at the broader lens, if we look at the research carried out in the United States, back in 2017, there was a very comprehensive research review of all of the research, looking at instructional programs that promoted the educational success of children and youth learning English. This was published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and it was put together by a panel of about 30 top-level researchers to articulate the synthesis of what the research is actually saying. And here's a couple of quotations from their conclusions. They say a growing body of research dating back to the 1960s reveals that the two languages of bilinguals do not exist in isolation, and to the contrary are highly interactive. The two languages of bilinguals share a cognitive or conceptual foundation that can facilitate the acquisition and use of more than one language for communication, thinking, and problem solving. They want to say the languages of bilinguals do not develop in isolation from one another. Evidence indicates that certain aspects of dual language learning, processing, and usage are significantly and positively correlated, and that the development of strong L1 skills supports the development of English L2 skills. And again, they point out that there's a huge amount of research showing positive correlations between literacy skills in students' English, the major school language, and the development of literacy skills in their home language. Years ago, more than 40 years ago, about 45 years ago, I came up with a visual metaphor to try and express what the research was saying. And this was back in 1981. And the research at that point clearly highlighted the fact that students in bilingual programs were doing at least as well and frequently better than students in all English programs in terms of the development of English language skills. And I suggested that if we thought about language proficiency as an iceberg, and this was a visual metaphor that a linguist called Roger Shai came up with in the late 70s. If we took that notion of language proficiency being an iceberg, where what we see on the surface, the everyday language that we interact with is in a way the surface features. But when we look at what's important in terms of language proficiency related to success in school, we have vocabulary knowledge, we have the ability to become aware of how language works. We've got a lot of things that are less visible above the surface. And again, as we know, what we see above the surface in an iceberg is much smaller than what's below the surface. And what this dual iceberg representation is trying to say is that even though the surface features of the two languages or the multiple languages of multilinguals may be distinct or separate in many respects, there's a lot of overlap or interdependence underneath the surface. And so the research shows clearly that bilingual children transfer concepts, language learning strategies, and linguistic knowledge across languages when the development of literacy in both languages is promoted in the school context. In other words, although the surface aspects of different languages can clearly be distinguished, there's an underlying conceptual proficiency or knowledge base that's common across languages. There's a more dynamic and maybe more attractive visual metaphor that was suggested by a New Zealand researcher called Sophie Tuea-Tamati in her PhD dissertation that was published in 2016. And she made reference to a tree that's native to New Zealand, the Kaikatea tree. And this tree grows in waterlogged, swampy soil and is characterized by a network of entangled roots that bind multiple trees together, thereby enhancing the strength of each individual tree. And her point is that multilingualism is similar to that. The languages are not separate from each other. They intertwine, they interact dynamically, and that interaction gives each individual language potentially additional strength. There's a list here of some of the things that research shows transfer across languages. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but you can see that many aspects of language can be transferred across from one language to another. So the second point that I want to make is that there, as I mentioned before, there's a difference between conversational fluency and academic language proficiency. They're all part of our language proficiency, but when we talk about conversational fluency, we're talking about the ability to carry on a conversation in familiar face-to-face situations. This is the kind of language that children aged 4 to 5 from virtually every society have mastered by the time they come to school, or the vast majority of them have mastered this. They can talk about whatever they want to talk about. They can understand what any reasonable adult is likely to say to them. But this language involves use of high frequency words and relatively straightforward grammatical constructions. And this is different from the kind of language that students are required to master and use in both oral and written forms in school. We're talking about knowledge of less frequent vocabulary, as well as the ability to understand and produce increasingly complex written language. In a language like English, there's frequent use of the passive voice and nominalization, where we make an abstract noun out of a verb or sometimes an adjective. The word like acceleration or fluctuation, these are all words that we tend not to use very much in everyday conversation with our friends, but will come up in a variety of contexts in schooling. And an essential point here is that because we find academic language primarily in books and printed texts, students who are into reading, students who enjoy reading, students who are reading a lot in school and outside of school have a huge potential advantage in mastering this kind of language. Just to illustrate what I'm talking about, this was a list of words that I pulled out of a grade 5 unit on the American Revolution. This is a social studies textbook in the United States. So 11-year-old children were faced with words like ratify, preamble, amend, etc. Clearly, these are words that most of us will never use in, or very rarely use in everyday conversation. But it illustrates the fact that we're looking at very different kinds of language that are required for success in school. So that's a brief summary, an overview of what the international research is saying. And if we look at some of the emerging understandings that have come in the last, say, 10, 15 years, there are things that we have become more aware of that I think are relevant to think about when we talk about mother tongue-based multilingual education. Because clearly the research shows that it's crucially important where it's possible to build on the foundation of students' mother tongue. But also the research suggests that there are a lot of advantages to teaching for transfer across languages, teaching to bring the two languages into productive contact with each other. And I'll illustrate this in the next few minutes. So if we look at the broader research literature, sorry, Sina, I'm not sure if everybody could turn off their microphone, that would really help me because it's very distracting. There are two opposing claims that are out there, that one of which is supported by the research, one of which is refuted by the research. One of them is that the claim that students' home language and second language in bilingual education programs should be kept separate and isolated from each other to the extent possible. And the rationale for this is to ensure that students' home language doesn't interfere with the learning of the second language. And in Canadian French immersion programs, this has been an axiom, basically, in many bilingual programs implemented in different contexts. Again, this has been assumed. The emergence of the concept of translanguaging or pedagogical translanguaging over the last 15 years suggests that we need to rethink this. And the second claim, which I would strongly endorse, is the cross-linguistic transfer claim. And this makes the point that second language immersion and bilingual programs would be even more successful when teachers systematically encourage students to bring the two languages into productive contact. This teaching for transfer will enhance cross-linguistic processing and build students' awareness of similarities and differences between their languages. The two solitudes approach was, I guess, first articulated by Wallace Lambert, who was a major researcher, psychologist involved in the evaluation of French immersion programs in Canada. There's a quotation there from him that, in the interest of times, I won't go into, but basically he's saying that in second language immersion programs, bilingualism is developed through two separate monolingual instructional routes, because he was arguing that we need to keep the two languages separate. So the assumptions underlying this is that languages should be kept separate, the target language should be used exclusively with no switching between languages, and translation across languages is never appropriate. All of these claims, I would argue, are problematic. So the problem with this monolingual instruction claim is that it's led to restrictive pedagogical possibilities with very little opportunity for students to showcase their growing intellectual and literacy skills in the two languages. And because the students' languages are kept in isolation from each other, teachers are less likely to point to relationships between the languages. They're less likely to encourage students to write dual language books or use both languages in projects or classroom activities, because this would involve translation. And they're less likely to promote students' awareness of how language works, for example, by contrasting grammatical patterns in first and second languages. Um, so in the last 15 years, the notion of pedagogical translanguaging has come into play. I'm not going to go into any detail, but people have defined this in different ways. But the way I would define it is instruction designed to enable students to use their entire multilingual repertoire in carrying out academic tasks and activities. And teaching for cross-linguistic transfer, I would define as instruction that encourages and supports students in bringing their languages into productive contact. There's the project that Margaret Early and I were involved in some time ago involved, or some of the teachers took the initiative to encourage students to use their home language in writing activities, to write dual language books. And these books were published in hard copy in the classroom. Sometimes they became part of the school library. They were put up on school web pages. And just two examples here I'll mention briefly. One is this a story called Tom Goes to Kentucky, written by a student who'd come from Israel. He was in grade 6, so he was 12 years old in his first year of learning English. And his reflection on this whole process was that I think using your first language is so helpful, because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. And that's an identity statement. Not too many 12-year-old young people like the feeling of being incompetent, impotent, not able to express themselves, being like a baby. You don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. This is a very clear experiential rationale for mother tongue-based multilingual education. Tomer goes on to say it makes it more faster to be able to use both languages instead of just breaking your head to think of the word in English when you already know the word in another language. So it makes it faster and easier to understand. Some of the instructional strategies that are involved in encouraging students to write in two languages are listed there. It scaffolds instruction by engaging students' multilingual repertoires. Their first language acts as a bridge to expanding their second language skills. It reinforces their understanding of academic language. It engages students' multilingual abilities by promoting cross-linguistic transfer. It expands literacy engagement. It connects to students' lives and it affirms students' identities. In the second example, these three students from Pakistan wrote a dual language book called The New Country. Kanta, whom you see on the right there, and Sulmana had been in Canada since about grade 4, but Madiha on the left had just arrived about 6 weeks before they started this unit. They wrote the book. They planned the book originally in Urdu. That way Madiha, who spoke very little English, was a full participant in planning it. They wrote the first draft in English, discussed it with the teacher who made some suggestions and provided some feedback, and then they translated it from Urdu then into English. And the result is a dual language book, 20-page dual language book, beautifully written, beautifully illustrated, that's been read by thousands of people. And Kanta's reflections on this, when she and her co-authors and their teacher presented at a Teachers of English conference in Toronto a couple of years later, was this. She says, and how it helped me was when I came here in grade 4, the teachers didn't know what I was capable of. I was given a pack of crayons and a coloring book and told to get on coloring with it. And after I felt so bad about that, I'm capable of doing much more than just that. I have my own inner skills to show the world other than just coloring. And I felt that those skills of mine are important also. So when we started writing the book, I could actually show the world that I am something instead of just coloring. And that's how it helped me. And it made me so proud of myself that I am actually capable of doing something. And here today at the Ontario TESOL conference, I am actually doing something. I'm not just a coloring person. I can show you that I am something. I think this expresses so clearly the link between literacy and identity, the link between acknowledging students' home languages and identity. I'll just go through this. This is an example of teaching for cross-linguistic transfer in a French immersion program. You can read this yourselves. But one of the things that is involved and one of the rationales for teaching for transfer across languages is the notion of reprocessing. And this notion hasn't got a lot of attention. I've only been able to find 3 examples in the second language or bilingual education or immersion literature. But basically, what the notion of reprocessing is saying is that students will, even when they're not encouraged to, will often reprocess what they've learned in one language in the other. And this solidifies and deepens their knowledge. Imagine if we were to teach for transfer and encourage students to reprocess what they've learned in mathematics in one language in the other language. Or if they've written a story in their mother tongue, then go from that story that they've written in their mother tongue to a version in the dominant societal or school language. You're reprocessing the concepts, you're expanding them. So I think this is a useful concept to keep in mind as we think about how we might organize mother tongue-based multilingual education programs. So again, there's a little framework that I've come up with that I think captures a lot of what the research is saying about literacy development. Here, it's written here in the context of literacy development generally, but it applies to bilingual and multilingual contexts. When we look at what's involved for students from minority or marginalized group backgrounds in terms of developing strong literacy skills in both the school language and their home language, what happens at the preschool level is important. If students are involved in a rich linguistic and literacy broadly defined context, and that includes storytelling and engaging with elders, that is providing a foundation that will help them as they acquire literacy in school. And then there's 2 broad things that we need to do. We need to consistently focus on demystifying how language works, on building up students' awareness of how their home language connects to the school language. And that should go from kindergarten right through to the end of school. But also, we need to focus on promoting strong engagement with language, with using language and using literacy throughout schooling. And if both of those are in place, students' academic development, their literacy development will be optimized. And part of this involves creating a community and an interpersonal space for identity affirmation, where students are using their home language that is being affirmed as a valuable part of who they are, a valuable part of their schooling. But it's also connected up with the expansion of that identity through literacy. So to finish up, in terms of thinking about where we want to go educationally with our students, and this applies to any context, like we could ask ourselves, what is the image of the students that we're sketching in our instruction? So who do we want these students to become? What identity trajectories are we opening up to them as a result of the kind of schooling that we organize for them? Is the message that students getting in school that they're capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate, or multilingual and multiliterate? If instruction is only through a second language, they're probably not getting that message. Are they getting the message that they're capable of higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments? If they're never given opportunities in the early grades of school to do this kind of work because they may not understand the school language, then they're not getting this message. Are they getting the message that they're capable of creative and imaginative thinking, capable of creating literature and art, capable of generating new knowledge, capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues? These are all things that are within our power as educators to organize within the school. And so when we talk about and we think about mother tongue based multilingual education, I think we need to go beyond language. I think we need to think about what kind of abilities, what kind of cognitive skills, what kind of people do we want our schooling to promote? And this involves language, obviously, and language is crucial as part of students' identity. But we need to think about what kind of cognitive skills, what kind of engagement in the world we want these students to have. And I'll end there. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this seminar.
Thank you, Jim. We now invite Professor Ajit Mohanty to present his ideas. I have one additional request for you, Professor Mohanty. If you can also reflect on NEP 2020 while you bring your fundamental research to dialogue, how do we then proceed from our research to implementing a very strong multilingual education program and the role that mother tongue plays in that, which Jim was talking about all through. Over to you, Professor Mohanty.
Thank you, Minati and UNESCO, Dr. Uma Masood, NMRC, and of course, Jim and all of you present. I particularly thank Jim for this excellent presentation in which he has summed up 50 plus years of work on bilingual education and cross-linguistic transfer, which I think in many ways has been the foundation of multilingual education all over the world, and particularly multilingual education in India. In the 2009 book on multilingual education, which myself, Minati, and Toves Kutnakangas, Robert Philipson edited, it brings together research from number of different countries all over the world, in fact, in all the continents, to show the value and efficacy of bilingual, multilingual education, basically talking about the need to strengthen a child's home language, mother tongue, in order to facilitate development, facilitate educational development of a child, as well as facilitating learning of other languages, which is critical for education in multilingual societies. Right. Jim has actually talked about the necessity of cross-linguistic transfer and the necessity to build the identity of the children, particularly their languages, in developing children's cognitive skills as well as their academic language proficiency. He has repeatedly referred to the work that he and Margaret Orley published in 2011, I think, on identity text, where they are talking about projecting, allowing children to project their own identity, own cultural identity, linguistic identity into their academic work and all that. It's a kind of different way of looking at the need to foster identity. So it just goes beyond the language as such. It's more related to fostering and developing and I think giving primacy to the cultural and linguistic identity of a child. And I think Jim actually talked about, but didn't elaborate on the need for assertion of the language of a child, language and languages of a child. And I think if you I take up from the kind of presentation that Jim has made and his work, lifetime work, which has really impacted the way languages are taught all over the world. I will take up from that, and what I will do is, as Minati suggested, I will gradually come to the Indian context, the National Education Policy 2020 and its implications for mother tongue based multilingual education. And I will also, I think I was kind of expecting Jim to talk about translanguaging, but I think he chose to confine himself to bilingual, multilingual education, in particularly keeping the Indian context in mind. But I think his recent work on translanguaging and trying to point out the problems with what he calls the unitary translanguaging theory, as opposed to the kind of cross-linguistic translanguaging that we all of us have been talking about. I think he didn't go into that because he has written quite a bit in recent years, starting with his book in 2021 to a large number of papers which has published around that time till date. So what I will do is maybe towards the end of this discussion of mine, I will try to bring in this the problem of translanguaging, because I have a feeling that in India, at a point when multilingual education was getting wider acceptance, suddenly there has been some attempt to sort of devalue the role of mother tongue in multilingual education. Multilingual education is, in this case, broadly interpreted as education that leads to learning of English, learning of Hindi, and learning of major languages, and using mother tongue as a stepping stone or as a ladder to develop children into learning languages which are more significant or which are deemed as more significant. So I think it will be necessary to bring in this idea of language transfer and the cross-linguistic transfer idea, as well as the idea of translanguaging into the debate. Now, let me try and remind ourselves what Jim has been talking about all through his academic contributions. See, it's the first thing that all of us need to realize, and perhaps there is not enough of reiteration of this principle, which is necessary for education in a multilingual society, particularly education of the marginalized, minoritized communities. So any system, education as well as broader social system, that devalues language, cultures, and identities is disempowering. That is something that we need to keep as an overarching principle. That in a society where diversity needs to be emphasized, where diversity needs to be celebrated, any attempt to sort of evaluate specific languages, cultures, and identities is obviously disempowering. Now, in James, I think he didn't elaborate on this, but I'm sure quite a few of you have already read his work, I think 1996 onwards, his framework of societal power relations, where he talks about the collaborative power structure, which is more an additive kind of system, where if you empower one language, one culture, one identity, it also empowers the all others. Therefore, it talks about an identity power structure, as opposed to a power structure which is more coercive, where the dominant, and this is also what I have discussed in terms of my work on double divide, where I am talking about the hierarchy across languages in the world or languages in a multilingual society like India, where I have talked about the coercive kind of a relationship between dominant languages as well as minority or minoritized languages. So James talks about this coercive power structure, where the more power that is acquired or that is observed by the dominant language groups, the less is the power that is available for the minoritized languages and disadvantaged languages. So we are actually talking about the need to assert an additive power structure in education as well as in general social planning. Now, we know, particularly from Jim's work, that linguistic identity is central to this idea of power structure. And we also know that schools or any system that denies languages and linguistic identities, that amounts to denial of social justice. I think in 2009 also I wrote about language and poverty, how denial of tribal languages in education was contributing to the poverty of the tribal communities in India. In another work in 2013, I and Toves Skutnemkangas, we looked at the India and Nepal situation to show how denial of mother tongues was related to the denial of quality education and was contributing to poverty. So basically, therefore, affirmation of legitimacy of language varieties or of all the students in a classroom is necessary for social justice. So it's kind of a situation which follows from James' work on bilingual education and cross-linguistic transfer across languages, which suggests that when you have a classroom, and that is important to note, that unlike the North American context or most of the European context, where we are talking about one minority or minoritized less powerful language and another more powerful language like Spanish, English, or maybe other indigenous language and English and so on, it's important to remember that in Indian conditions, classrooms are much more diverse. It's not just one minority mother tongue and one or two dominant languages. It's very typical in Indian situation to have 3 to 4 or in some cases up to 5 languages present in the same classroom. Therefore, what is important is regardless of the kind of education or educational approach that one is following, regardless of whether you are into the mainstream kind of educational system where the teaching is done through the dominant language, or whether you are, or if you are in a kind of multilingual education framework where some kind of minoritized mother tongue is given more importance, we need to realize. Hello. Yeah. Okay. I think I request you to again to keep all the microphones switched off so that we don't have much of a disturbance. I will, once we stop, maybe individually each one of you can be given scope to interact. Okay, so what I was saying is affirmation of legitimacy of language varieties that children bring to a class is necessary for social justice. And in a multilingual society like India, what needs to be remembered that children, once they come out of the home situation, this is what Jim was talking about when we were distinguishing between the social skills, social communicative skills, or basic interpersonal communication skill, and academic, cognitive academic language proficiency. We need to understand that in multilingual societies like India, children start with the home variety of language or the mode of speaking that is typical of the family and so on. And then once they come out of their home context into the neighborhood and then go into the village market area, or as their sphere of interaction widens, there are multiple layers of languages which are nested onto each other with the mother tongue at the center. So this is what I have called the concentric layers of languages which are nested onto each other for a child. So what happens is the kind of multilingual repertoire that one is talking about. What happens to a child who grows up in a context much before going to school? The children grow up in contexts where they, starting with their mother tongue, they gradually bring into their sphere of what I have called multilingual socialization, the multiple languages which are gradually differentiated as well as integrated. It is differentiated in one sense that the child retains her mother tongue identity and at the same time gradually begins to identify with other languages. The child may not necessarily try to learn all the languages that she confronts in her multilingual milieu, but I think she would develop some degree of comfort in being able to communicate in some way or other in multiple situations. So the child goes to the marketplace, brings in little bit of other languages into her repertoire, and uses some of the languages that are necessary in different spheres of interaction or different domains of her language use. So what happens is a child starting with the mother tongue. I'm not talking about children who are into the school. That's a different context altogether. But even before going to the school, most Indian children confront multilingualism, and this is what we have characterized as multilingual socialization, in which children not only learn, they develop a notion of their own mother tongue, or develop the notion of their own language, and at the same time develop the awareness of other languages. They develop the awareness of the norms of using multilingual forms of communication, and so on. So what I have said in our work on multilingual socialization is that children gradually learn to deal with languages. I'm not even suggesting that they develop competence in multiple languages. What I'm suggesting is that children begin with their mother tongue, and gradually other languages are nested into their concentric layer of languages that they feel comfortable in being in that kind of situation. They may not have high levels of proficiency in the other languages they encounter, but they do not falter in being able to communicate in that kind of situation. They may use their own language, they may use a little bit of other languages without developing a high level of proficiency in the other language, but they would be comfortable. They know where do they cross boundaries of one language and the other, but they are not really so much conscious of the multilingual or crossing boundaries between one language and other, because in societal context, language boundaries are fluid. One doesn't know where does, for example, if you are moving in a Hindi belt, one wouldn't know where does Bhojpuri end and maybe Haryanvi begin. As you go from one language context to the other. So what happens is that when one is talking about multilingual socialization, children learn different languages in a very in a way they contribute to their communicative capacity. It's not learning a language as such. Learning different languages or bringing in different languages to their repertoire, so that children can use them languages as tools to make their communication more effective. For example, Cynthia Groff's work in where she points out that in Uttarakhand, no, I think, yeah, in the area where she has worked, she shows that people and children are quite comfortable with multiple languages coming in, and they have awareness of not only their own languages, but they also have awareness of hierarchy of languages in their context. Now, Minati's work in the border areas of Rajasthan and I think Gujarat and other states, where she shows that even forget about the adults. She has also data from adults which shows the same thing. Even children in the primary grades are able to identify their own mother tongue, identify their own language, or Hamari Bhasha, they would say, and also know what are the other languages, or how are their communication changes as they move from one area to the other within the same locality, or as they confront different language communities, how would they change, how would they would use what one could maybe broadly call translanguaging, going across from one language to the other. So what I'm saying basically is that children have the ability develop quite early in their preschool years, the ability to function in situations or in contexts which are multilingual. So it's not that children go just with one language to their school and then learn other languages. And that is where the European or North American bilingual education programs differ from the kind of education programs, multilingual education programs that we are talking about in India or in other multilingual societies in Asia and Africa and other places. Because when children join school, they already have multiple languages in their repertoire. And therefore, there are also cross-linguistic reflections, which, in a typical bilingual education program, you talk about children developing cross-linguistic reflection primarily through textual or through textual introduction as well as through classroom processes, focusing more on cognitive academic language use and so on. Now, in Indian situation, I think we need to realize that by the time children enter school, most children are somewhat comfortable with multiple languages. It's not necessary that all the languages they would eventually confront in the formal educational system are already known to them. It's not that. But they are already multilingual and they are socialized into multilingual modes of thinking. They are socialized into the multilingual norms of functioning in a society. That itself, I think, has already contributed to their cross-linguistic thinking. Thinking from the perspective of their own mother tongue and trying to figure out how are not only how is another language different, but how would one interact when speakers of a different language are present. I think I will not really elaborate on my work with children. I know a lot of work, not just a single study, but a series of studies beginning from, let's say, late 90s to 2006 or 7, 2000 up to 2009. We have shown, for example, the processes of multilingual socialization actually enable progressive development of multilingual communicative repertoire. The kind of communicative repertoire that a lot of people are talking about when one is talking about translanguaging or one is talking about how children learn different languages. We need to understand that children develop this communicative repertoire by developing an understanding of how languages are interrelated. So through socialization, multilingual socialization, children progressively learn to use languages as interrelated, overlapping, and integrated systems. At the same time, they differentiate languages. This is one thing I want to point out, that as children learn multilingualism, it is not that the languages are all merged together. The languages are differentiated at certain level, and children do continue with the identity of their mother tongue. I will come back to the question of mother tongue a little later, because that is something that is central to our understanding as to the nature. What should be, should we be talking about cross-linguistic transfer or translanguaging, and either children continue with their sense of mother tongue, or they just forget about mother tongue, because there are certain theoretical notions associated with translanguaging, which is talking about non-existence of language, talking about language as a non-entity or invented category. And now, or therefore, mother tongues do not exist, bilingualism, multilingualism doesn't exist. We all are only languaging. And, so I think I was kind of hoping that Jim would talk about this, but he has written quite a bit and he has sent some of his recent papers for all of us to read, where he clarifies this notion of what he calls the cross-linguistic translanguaging, which is what all of us are talking about. Children going across languages, developing awareness of different languages, thinking about one language through another and so on, and thinking about the relationship between languages, as opposed to the so-called strong version of translanguaging, where some people are talking about non-existence of language, non-existence of mother tongue, non-existence of bilingualism or multilingualism, non-existence of a transfer across languages and so on. So I think we need to be aware of this, because as I said, the strong translanguaging position is one that negates mother tongue, and that is one thing that we need to come to terms with, particularly in Indian context. So multilingual socialization, as I've been telling you, involves awareness of languages and language preferences across diverse contexts. There is, obviously, when languages are hierarchically distributed in a society or hierarchically positioned in a society, a child being socialized for multilingualism in that kind of a situation would perceive the relative hierarchy of languages. So multilingual socialization on the whole actually enables progressive development of multilingual communicative repertoire of complex and integrated systems of interrelated and overlapping languages that actually constitute a composite set of rules. It's, as I said, a child does not necessarily learn languages as such, different languages, other than the mother tongue, in which I think most children develop age-appropriate proficiency. But what children learn is to use different languages as part of their multilingual repertoire. Languages are used as composite sets of tools which complement each other and which form a synergistic network to make our communicative acts more effective. And this is what I have already written about it in my 2019 book, as well as subsequent work that I have published. Now, this integrated system that I have been talking about, when children grow up in a multilingual society, they develop an integrated system of languages, which has been otherwise characterized as multilingual repertoire. Now, we have actually Tove in introducing my book in 2019, Multilingual Realities. He used this notion of multilingualism as a past language, and subsequently Tove and we worked together in developing this notion of multilingualism as a past language. Unfortunately, Tove left us before I could really fully develop this idea. But subsequently, following from her leads, as well as following from the work that we had done initially, this is published in 2023, 22, and so on, we sort of comprehensively sought to characterize what she has called multilingualism as a past language. I think what I am suggesting, and before I go into characterization of multilingualism as a past language, what I am suggesting is that multilingualism as a past language be taken as a prototype of the way languages are represented in the mind, so that they are reflected in the process of our language instruction. And I will subsequently tell you why is it necessary for us to use this as a paradigm for multilingual education. Now, this MFL, or the multilingualism as a first language, involves actually competent engagement with societal multilingualism to communicate effectively and holistically. That is something that I have already described to you or elaborated. Then it involves, MFL involves learning multilingualism as the norm of communication rather than learning to use languages as separate systems. But again, learning to use languages as integrated system does not mean the child does not differentiate between languages. And as I will show later, child's mother tongue, notion of mother tongue is very interesting. A lot of people are debating, questioning the role and relevance of mother tongue. But for me, mother tongue is central to identity of a community or an individual, and I am arguing that it is not for the linguists to deny or to affirm mother tongue. It is for the community to know what their mother tongue is. Therefore, I have always repeatedly talked about mother tongue as the community's self-ascription. That is important. It's mother tongue. It's not somebody else to say that this is your mother tongue. Mother tongue is the self-ascription. I will come back to this later. So, learning to differentiate languages, including one's own mother tongue and other languages, and developing understanding of the interrelationship between languages, their functions, and mutual complementarity. Because we all have to realize that multiple languages complement each other in not only in making our cognitive structures and our information processing more effective, it also it's making our own communication much more effective. MFL also involves developing understanding of variations and diversity of languages in different social contexts, and also pragmatic knowledge of context-appropriate choice of languages. Children, for example, know when do they need to change from their mother tongue, maybe at least attempting to use a second or a third or other languages. So some kind of pragmatic knowledge which governs which regulates how languages are used in conjunction with each other or in interrelationship with each other. So MFL actually is conceptualized as a more holistic notion which views language as a unified system without any a priori assumption of hierarchy among them. It's not that in the MFL languages are hierarchized. MFL involves using all languages to express a child's identity and to enhance the communicative effectiveness of a child. This is something that, in a way, I think when Jim was talking about identity text, or how he gave example of a child from Pakistan where she was projecting her own identity into what she wrote and all that. So that kind of identity expression is necessary, and therefore I think MFL or the multilingualism as a first language is conceptualized as a holistic notion which views language as a unified system without any a priori assumption of hierarchy among them. So I think it's important to know that we need to engage with child's languages in a classroom or in any other context without any prejudicial hierarchy. That is because in the multilingualism as a first language kind of a concept, where I'm talking about the multilingual repertoire of a child. The hierarchization is not part of that conceptual system. Hierarchization is out there in the society, which treats some languages as more powerful and other languages as less powerful. So it is necessary for us to realize that, and therefore MFL, I suggest, it should be considered as a prototype for the classroom instruction. So MFL actually affirms the multiplicity of child's emerging linguistic identities and values each of her language as a resource for the social development and classroom learning. Unfortunately, we take multiple languages as a problem, as an issue, but not as a resource. That is why, even as we were trying to get out of this kind of a notion of treating some languages in educational system as more important, now the strong version of translanguaging position is now is kind of devaluing mother tongue, because it's denying mother tongue in a way. So not just devaluing, it's completely denying mother tongue. And therefore it becomes easier, it facilitates learning of English and learning of dominant languages, and mother tongue is used only as a tool for facilitating development of major languages. And that's an unfortunate trend, because there was a point, I think, where we showed convincingly our own Minati and I, we conducted this major project, MLE Plus or Multilingual Education Plus, along with experiments Odisha and then earlier Andhra experiments, and subsequently Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, and many other states, where it has been consistently shown that when you facilitate development of mother tongue, it not only facilitates the development of other languages, but it also facilitates academic achievement and scholastic achievement of a child. So learning of English, learning of dominant state language, learning of Hindi, and academic achievement in other subject areas in the classroom, they significantly improve as a result of multilingual education, which emphasizes mother tongue and uses mother tongue till the end of the primary grades. Now, what is happening now in India, and that is one thing that we need to talk about, and from there I will come to the new education policy, because Minati has requested me to specifically bring in the 2020 education policy and its recommendations into this discussion. So I think we need to see that languages are our resources and not our problems, and therefore it's not that the mother tongue of a child is only used as a ladder or as a bridge. The bridge metaphor is often used in bilingual, multilingual education. It is as if mother tongue is only a bridge or a facilitator for acquisition of more dominant languages. I think that notion has to go. Unfortunately, again, as it was about to go in Indian situation, because we had, I thought, convincingly demonstrated through a variety of work all over the country that mother tongue needs to be fostered for at least 5 to 7 years, when the child is free to learn in other languages as medium of instruction, not just as a subject. But what the recent trend is to kind of push the mother tongue down only as a ladder and then promote other languages, and that's very unfortunate. I think SIL and various other organizations, including some in our own country, in India, they are trying to sort of undermine the role of mother tongue, which has been facilitated by this new wave of so-called translanguaging, which is in its strong form, is denying the existence of languages, existence of multilingualism, existence of mother tongue as entities, as opposed to what Jim has been talking about as cross-linguistic translanguaging theory, or CTT, cross-linguistic theory of translanguaging, where, okay, children do have multiple languages, the language, there is transfer across languages, and therefore there is necessarily some kind of cross-linguistic thinking, cross-linguistic expression, and cross-linguistic use in the classroom, where the more the child learns mother tongue, the better it is for other languages and so on, as opposed to the idea that, okay, the languages do not exist, and mother tongues do not exist, and therefore just use the so-called mother tongue or home language or whatever that is to facilitate learning of more dominant languages and then forget about mother tongue. So I think we need to understand that kind of a situation. So and because we need to know what is actually translanguaging. For me, translanguaging is the natural occurrence of the cross-lingual use or flow in situations of multilingual interaction. In fact, Suresh Kanagraja 2013 actually defined translanguaging in that kind of a framework, where he talked about translanguaging or translingual communication as the ability to merge different language resources in situated interactions in new meaning construction, for new meaningful construction. So it's a natural process. But I think what has happened is we have gone into a situation that schools, the monolingual instructional strategy, and that is something that Jim was referring to when he talked about solitude orientation to languages, where languages are kept isolated from each other. Now, what is being suggested is that in a multilingual education or in any classroom situation, languages should not be isolated from each other. There is no need to keep isolated the languages as isolated, because we are in a social situation. Child grows up in a social situation where multiple languages are used in congruence with each other, in mutual facilitation of each other, and to make the communicative act more effective. So I think what we have shown, Minati, and in one paper, for example, Minati, myself, Minati, and Rasim Pal in 2010, we showed that how even in tribal kind of situation, where a teacher does not know the mother tongue of a child, how this teacher is making an effort to bring in mother tongue as early as possible. So I think what is necessary is that we need to realize that the mother tongues have a place, and this is what Jim has very succinctly and so powerfully brought to our notice, that mother tongues have to be fostered. And at the same time, what we need is to sort of reconceptualize the multilingual repertoire of a child and how it facilitates learning of other languages and how it facilitates education in general. Now, briefly coming to the new education policy, the idea that mother tongue is to be strengthened, and the idea that multilingualism comes as a strength to the child is there in the NEP 2020. For the first time in all our earlier language policies were actually emphasizing mother tongue. But this is the first policy which not only emphasizes mother tongue, but brings in the notion of multilingualism as a strength. Therefore, what it is suggesting is that you build on the mother tongue strength of a child and gradually develop the multilingual repertoire of the child. So what in addition I am suggesting is that when you talk of mother tongue, you also think of the multilingual repertoire which is already there in the child. In other words, when by the time a child comes to school, the child already has certain degree of awareness of other languages, has certain degree of learning how to transfer between one language and the other, and that needs to be emphasized. So the new education policy, in fact, talks about strengthening the mother tongue, keeping the mother tongue as a medium of instruction at least till about grade 5 and preferably till about grade 8, and then you bring in other languages and make strengthen child's multilingual competence, not just competence in academic use of different languages, but also in developing an awareness of the general multilingual context of the society and so on. Therefore, there has been a good beginning. Although I think the NEP 2020 is still far from realizing the full potentials of multilingual education. And as Anvita Abi said the other day, and in the earlier NMRC lecture, and as we have written severally, three language formula, emphasizing only three languages is little limiting, and one needs to reconsider as to whether when we are talking about three languages or when we are talking about multilingualism, whether it is necessary to confine ourselves to three languages. Three languages is a broad kind of a framework which actually meant to facilitate movement from mother tongue to other languages and not just to restrict multilingualism only to three languages. So I think we need to realize that, and I would again reiterate what Jim has been saying in terms of strengthening the role of mother tongue in education, strengthening the identity of a child's linguistic identity, and creating classroom environments in a multilingual society where all languages of children are taken as their resources and not as problems. I think I would stop here and maybe wait for some discussion on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. I think both Professor Jim and you have complemented each other on the linguistic foundations of linguistic basis of multilingual mind and multilingual education, and also giving a very broad, deep sociolinguistic realities of our communities. Of course, we are now talking in the context of language, where we make a deliberate decision about how to go about languages of children, their intersubjective resources, and also how do we scaffold their learning in higher classes. I just want to say one small thing, and then we will take questions. Because we hear linguists, educationists, psychologists, anthropologists, and sociologists, and also political scientists on language and education. What I find is that language has a linguistic reality, like it has a cognitive reality, but it also has a very, very strong social reality, where languages are deeply tied to children's identities, communities' identities, their aspirations, and therefore are also determining very actively how children are positioned in relation to power in classrooms. How, and that's also a default story of how different communities are positioned in relation to each other in terms of power. And so when we deconstruct, children's languages to an extent that their linguistic identities are, I'll not say suppressed, but are dealt very differently, say in the context of translanguaging, yes, linguistic fluidity is important. We all are multilinguals. And at the level of brain, we may be translanguaging. I agree with Professor Cummins that is not unitary, definitely, but there is a cross-linguistic transfer happening all the time at the level of our brain and also at mind. But then when there is a clear hierarchy of languages tied deeply to social realities of communities, I think it's also very important to talk about the rights of those communities and children which are at the margin, which are at the risk of becoming further minoritized or delegitimized or even completely invisibilized in education over a period of time. And that's where the decision, the pedagogic decision can't be taken only on the linguistic reality. It has to take into account social reality. I think both of you have discussed this, taking a lot of your very fundamental early research and have placed your ideas. I'm really thankful to both of you. We'll now open the session to others. I see some of the questions in chat. So, Varsa, how do we go about?
Ma'am,
Like we take
Homa
first
ma'am
questions.
has
Yeah.
raised her hand, so we can
Okay.
go to her first and then we can take questions from chat box.
Yeah, please raise your hands and be very brief so that we can take more questions. And you also read out some questions from the chat subsequently. Yeah, Huma.
Thank you very much, Professor Cummins and Professor Mohanty. It has been definitely a very enriching session to the extent that they were almost like 24 or 10 people, participants. And that means it shows that there's so much of interest in people. And in fact, they could have been more, but then we had limitations of the numbers who can participate. Now going forward to and coming back to, I would say, to our State of the Education report. Our learning over here and the discussion is also that we could enrich and contribute to the SOER. In that context, I would like to know from our knowledgeable speakers that Dr. Mohanty did mention about our policy, NEP policy, and I would like to know that in the a few questions I have, that when we are talking about this policy, then how is it that there should be institutional convergence and what kind of systemic coordination is required? One. Number two, if in the context of teachers we speak, then what is the multilingual pedagogy which is sustainable and should be part of the classroom as well as the teacher education programs? In your experience, I'm sure that you have looked at the aspects of community participation and cultural anchoring which happens, and if it has any significance, what would you be recommending to us? If I'm not putting up too many questions, then there's also something which I would like to very briefly hear, and we will try to have later a one-to-one conversation more detailed conversation at some point of time, wherein we would also like to know about the assessment reforms which are required in multilingual settings, or whatever you call language mechanisms which are required. So how do we strengthen policy practice linkages for more transformative and very strong multilingual education in India in order to see that there is justice, educational justice, and a kind of a reframing of multilingual education through this SOER, which we can showcase. Over to both the speakers, and kindly make your choice of how you like to take a lead. I am sure I put too many things and too many questions. So we don't want you to go into detail, and you have a choice to suggest that this could be also done directly with Minity.
I think.
Thank you.
I think James should address this question, but let me frame it from for him in our context so that it will be easier for him to respond. Now, what has happened in India is that as we took off from your James conceptualization of bilingual education to mother tongue based education in different forms, going through a process of evolution, something that had started in the Central Institute of Indian Languages by Professor Patnaik and his colleagues. I think what we did is we tried to bring in this idea of mother tongue as forming the base of subsequent education in multiple languages, because one of the things that we realized in this country that children cannot do with only two languages or maybe one or two languages, because you need languages for immediate communication, languages for state level communication, languages for national level and international communication. So therefore 3 to 4 languages, at least for a tribal language, tribal child in Odisha, for example, the tribal child must have her mother tongue, must have Odia, must have Hindi and English. So 3 to 4 languages, that is why 3 language formula is little limiting, because there are a lot of children who need 4 languages. So the idea was to bring in mother tongue as the anchor on the basis of which the children will develop in the classroom situation, develop multiple languages, something that actually takes on from the James' idea of cross-linguistic transfer and facilitating cross-linguistic transfer. Now that is one. The other issue that we have in India is multiple language classrooms. Certainly it is not possible for a society of this order to bring in mother tongue education for all children in all languages and so on. So what happens is we had necessarily to deal with classrooms which are multilingual, if not, even if the classroom teaching system is monolingual. Therefore, our broader teaching paradigm is monolingual, which emphasizes mostly a dominant state language, whereas the children sitting in front of a teacher in a classroom are multilingual. They bring in multiple languages into there. And it has been shown variously, at least 3 to 5 languages are present in at least 90% of our classrooms. Therefore, that is, so bringing in or creating a situation where languages are used as resources, as Jim has repeatedly pointed out. Therefore, there are 2 issues. One is how to bring in multilingual education without denial of mother tongue and all that, which your strong versions of the translanguaging theory are now proposing. And second is how to use languages as resources when multiple languages are present, but this teacher is still mandated to bring in the dominant language. So these are the issues. I'm sure Jim would be able to respond to these questions. I know it's complex, but yeah.
Thanks, Ajit. It's challenging to address even a fraction of the issues that everybody has brought up. But let me just pick up on one point, and that's the variety of languages that are normalized or that are normal within a particular classroom. This has parallels with the reality that I think researchers only began to think about for example, in a North American context in the 90s, because the focus before that was on bilingual education, or in the case of majority language students, second language immersion programs. And there's obviously no curriculum manual that's going to give you lesson plans for teaching the variety of languages that are represented in your classroom. So the default option was just to use the dominant language. And I think in the Indian context, as you pointed out, where you have 4 or 5 different languages in any typical classroom, there's a similarity to that. What has begun to change things in a North American context is the creativity of teachers who, in the context of projects that involve collaboration between university researchers and educators, and I'll speak of the projects that I was involved in. We didn't go in to the schools with any kind of prescription. The schools decided what the agenda was. And in one particular context, the agenda for the schools was, how do we get more parental involvement in a context where, the parents are in the process of learning English, same as their children, and et cetera. We sat around for about 6 months with about 12 teachers from a particular school, just brainstorming some of the issues that might be addressed here. And one of the teachers, or at least I introduced a book, a very small book written by a British researcher, Viv Edwards, called The Power of Babel. It focused on what teachers were doing in context of multilingualism. And one of the chapters in that book involved teachers using bilingual books. So books this is in the British context, and there are a lot of South Asian languages obviously represented there. But these were commercial books that had been produced in English and other languages. And one of the teachers thought, this is a great idea, let me try this. She tried to get those books in languages that were represented in her class. And this is a school with 80% of the students from non-English speaking backgrounds. And she couldn't find any that were easily accessible. So she thought, well, why don't we do this ourselves? And that led to a project where she encouraged students to write either in English initially or in their home languages initially, and then translate across languages. So this was the teachers' initiative. The examples that I gave in my talk were also the teachers' initiatives. So when we look at what has caused change in mindset, caused change in policy, certainly in the Canadian context and in a context like the Irish context, it's the teachers' initiative in the classroom for addressing these issues. And when we're to compile at this point the range of initiatives that teachers have come up with, it's really, really impressive internationally. And so the whole notion of teachers as knowledge generators is one that I think might be interesting to talk about or think about in the Indian context, where the researchers in the universities are not the ones to come up with the pedagogical initiatives. It's the educators in classrooms. If once they realize that there are possibilities, there are pedagogical possibilities that have been tried in various contexts that might be relevant to a particular classroom that a teacher's in, and also that teachers are the ones whose creativity, both individually and collectively, have led to all kinds of possibilities. That opens up a huge range of pedagogical freedoms for teachers. And so the context of this in terms of collaboration between researchers and educators would be to collaborate with schools, with school districts, to encourage this kind of innovation in classrooms like the ones you're talking about that are highly multilingual, and then to document in case studies what teachers have done so that then other teachers can see this and realize that, yes, it is possible to do really interesting, powerful instructional initiatives in this kind of context that not only communicate to students that their mother tongues are important, not only enable them to do interesting things communicatively and in writing with their mother tongues, but also to challenge what Mohanty was talking about in terms of the power relations in the broader society, the marginalization and the hierarchy of languages outside the school. So creating contexts where this kind of innovation is possible, I think is a very powerful strategy. Certainly in the Canadian context and in the Irish context, it has led to profound changes in ministry documents and what ministries are encouraging teachers to do. So that may be something that is a useful perspective in the Indian context.
Yeah. Okay, let me just briefly add that sometime back in an Odia medium classroom, which had 3 different tribal communities present, what we did is, this was again teachers' initiative. Teachers planned a lesson. For example, there is a story about this, we all know the common story of the crow feeling thirsty and trying to fill up a pot to get some water. Now, what we did is the teacher did draw only the picture cards, and asked each of the children to describe or tell the story showing the pictures in whatever language they felt comfortable with. So they would bring in some Odia, they would bring in some of their own mother tongue and so on. So in the process, what happened is we realized that children at the end of it not only understood the story, because different language children were telling the stories, but they also developed an awareness of other languages.
Yeah.
For example, children were able to say what is a crow in Kui language, what is a crow in Saura language or in Odia language. So that kind of conceptualization and understanding of how things are represented in different languages and all that really contributed to my understanding to children's cross-linguistic thinking and cross-linguistic awareness. Unfortunately, this was a small experiment, single shot experiment, and we couldn't continue because of lack of funding and all that. But this is the kind of thing where prioritizing not just one language, but many languages in the classroom, I think would help.
Yeah, exactly. I agree completely.
In Multilingual Education Plus program, we actually had developed 40 early readers, with the help of teachers in tribal areas who, used a lot of children's stories to develop early readers, bilingual early readers. Those were not multilingual in that sense, but they retained the linguistic fluidity of the region. In the sense, the Saura Odia bilingual early readers used Saura language, which had some Odia words or Telugu words that were naturally imported. Those were part of Saura language at that point of time. Similarly, the Odia was also the language that we spoke in that region. And it was done very effortlessly, very creatively. I think what I liked about both of your, emphasis on this pedagogical possibilities, and also, teachers and students being given some agency to develop teaching learning materials in multilingual repertoire. And also multilingualism is about several strategies like translation, transliteration, several translanguaging, multilanguaging. So it's not just one, multilingual strategy that we use. And therefore, translanguaging, when it becomes the only term, also becomes very limiting. I see Shivani Nag raising her hand. Shivani, would you like to ask the question directly? You also seem to have written it somewhere.
So that it would save time also. But yeah, I'll just ask it. So thank you both, Professor Mohanty and Professor Cummins, so much. Learned so much from you always. My question is, that NEP does hold forth some imagination of lingual education to some extent and a lot more of education in multiple languages at different level. And one also appreciates, linguistic assertion by different communities that one finds. But I'm also thinking in the current political climate of India, what we've witnessed in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, how do we take forward this inclusive agenda, right? Where languages do not get pitted against each other. Because in NEP also, when it talks about multiple languages, the only concern is, where certain parameters of which is a more scientific language or which is a more beautiful language kind of gets referred to, putting languages on a hierarchy. So one wonders that in this, the tribal languages may remain even more silenced. So in this political climate, how do we take these multiple languages together and not this pitting? Just that. This is for Professor Mohanty. Thank you.
In the current scenario, it's not very different from the world scenario. World over, UNESCO has been emphasizing the need for mother tongue since the 50s. And then even now, we have many countries which do not recognize that, which do not recognize the indigenous languages. They insist on the dominant language-based education and sort of treating language as a substitute. I think in India also the same thing. We have a national policy which talks about the need for fostering mother tongue, promoting mother tongue, and then bringing in multilingualism. There is an apprehension among many states that two things are happening. One is undermining the role of English and emphasizing the role of Hindi. These are the two points of departure for different kind of states. Now, I think we need not be so much bothered about that at the moment, because if we are able to demonstrate the efficacy of mother tongue based education, if we are able to demonstrate the need to foster multiple language awareness in the classroom, then I think the other states which are not really appreciative of this would learn or to change their approach. Because see, the dominance of languages is a primary consideration in human thought and human identity construction. So what is happening in the southern part of India is the apprehension of Hindi being more dominant, and they would rather side with English rather than Hindi. Therefore, that kind of thing, you accept dominance of English but not dominance of Hindi. That's the kind of situation. So I think we need not be, I think Uma was raising this question about institutional convergence as well as the sustainability of multilingual pedagogy. There will not be complete institutional convergence. But I think as much as possible, it is necessary to bring in this, the position papers on languages which came out of the National Curricular Framework and all that prepared, and we are working with NCERT to develop a framework for language education. So once that gets propagated, a state may or may not accept it, but eventually they will come to realize the necessity for bringing in multiple languages in education. Whether those multiple languages would be Tamil, English, and other South Indian language, or Tamil, Hindi, and all that is a different matter. Let us not bother about that. I think we should all bother about the necessity for bringing in mother tongue and bringing in multiple languages. That I think should clear the road for us, and then the future will perhaps change. The approaches will change.
Sure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor. So let's take a few questions from chat and then we can go to next hand raised. Okay. So Angmo is asking, how can the MLE model be effectively adapted to extremely low resource indigenous communities where teacher training and materials in the mother tongue are nearly absent?
Again, it's the same thing. We have worked with, in Odisha as well as, other states, Chhattisgarh, Assam, and other places. Minati knows very well. There have been communities where there is not much of a resource. But once you bring in the community members, whosoever, the workers, the farmers, the artisan, and all that, it is evident that the community has a store of knowledge. Community, for example, Minati's work shows that each community has a tradition of mathematical knowledge. So what has happened is when you talk about a low resource community, we assume that this community doesn't have its own fund of knowledge, which is not true. Community has its own fund of knowledge, and if you use that as a base to produce textual material as well as teaching learning material based on that, I think it should facilitate, because it's a cumulative process. The moment, for example, in Odisha, the moment you bring in a textbook for primary grades in tribal language, that generates a lot of other material, that generates development of dictionary or lexicon of language, that again that leads to production of other material which is related. So this goes on and on. So the idea is to start the process, even if it's a low resource community, as you say. If we start this process will have a cumulative effect, which in the long term will perhaps revitalize the language. That question of revitalizing languages, low resource languages, is necessary, where the number of speakers are dwindling and all that in Northeast in particular. We need to bring that. We start this process. You re-emphasize the need to bring in the language of a community into education, and that itself, I think a lot of people, Ferguson, for example, talked about the need, the education in a language being central to revitalization of language. I think that I still believe that it should be possible to do that.
Can I join the dialogue just for a minute? Angmo, this extremely low resource indigenous communities, most of the anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists actually haven't found what Professor Mohanty was talking about. All communities have some kind of language because they have been surviving for centuries. Sorry, some kind of knowledge, and that knowledge is rich. The question is that how do we then use that knowledge and create a kind of contact between that knowledge and the knowledge that others have, and also the kind of knowledge that we talk about in formal educational systems. So yeah, this articulation is bit problematic, low resource, high resource. I mean, the moment the language is used, it starts becoming high resource, linguistically, high resource communities. Yeah. Angmo is from our center and doing very interesting work in Ladakh.
Yeah, and next
Professor,
question is,
question.
yeah. So next two questions are somehow related. Anil and Ipshita. Anil is asking, how do you see multilingualism in urban government schools where, urban government schools in English language classrooms in middle and secondary classes in relation to NEP 2020 that has paid a lot of emphasis on multilingualism, where the child is sometimes not exposed to its own home language, and there are initiatives to offer foreign languages like German or French. Similarly, Ipshita is asking on the same line. According to the 2011 census report, 1,369 mother tongues were identified across India, which were broadly categorized into 270 mother tongues. However, within the higher education system, academic instruction is offered only in 22 official languages. What could be the ways of ensuring that children do not have to abandon their mother tongue within the educational context in India, considering the large number of languages that exist among the student population?
I think there's another question which you can take
Yeah.
together, Professor Mohanty, which is talking about urban context where in the same class several languages are spoken. So what kind of pedagogic strategies we need? Yeah.
The first thing that we need to do in all cases is to empower the child teacher. As long as the teacher is there and he's given that freedom, even if the classrooms have children from marginalized communities, languages, and so on, the teacher will evolve a strategy, number one, and that's important. And I think the rest of this is how do we go about it? What are the resources actually? The cost is not that much. There are a lot of work. I think Tove addressed it in severally in our work. Francois Green's work on economics of language talks about how it is possible, even with minimum resources, to bring in languages because they have their own dividends. So, a country like Papua New Guinea, for example, using more than nearly 600 languages in their primary education system should be an eye-opener for a country like India. We seem to be throwing our hands up, saying, too many languages, how can we deal with it? I think that is not the approach. Approach is to begin with some languages at least and gradually add on to our system and get people involved in developing programs in different languages and so on. And it's not really, it's a more resource efficient. And Minati had worked with the Planning Commission sometime back on tribal education and so on. She would probably tell you much more than I can about how it is possible, because what is the cost of not having language? Let us not ask what is the cost of having a language into our education system. What is the cost of not having? If we have 90% of the children dropping out by grade 10 because their language is not represented in the classroom, we should rethink our economics of education. Minati may be better able to elaborate on that.
Just very quickly, this was 12th, Planning Commission report where I was chairing the section on education of tribal children. I just took the data on dropout, and when we addressed that, then multilingual education started appearing more economical because children stay longer if their language and knowledge is included in the classroom. And therefore, if we look at how long they stay in the system and then factor that into the cost of per child cost of education, then we find MLE providing a cheap alternative to more exclusionary monolingual education. Yeah, that was 12th. And the report is there with Planning Commission. Yeah.
Yeah.
Next question, Barsa.
Barsa, you need to.
Sorry, the
Yeah.
next question is from Himalaya.
Yeah.
He's asking, how much the political rhetoric practically affects multilingualism in schools?
My own response is the political rhetoric does not affect. Despite the fact that Tamil Nadu has been denying the role of Hindi, Hindi songs, Hindi movies, and some Hindi communication is quite common. Let us not deny that. Therefore, that this country is multilingual at the grassroots level should not really be forgotten, regardless of the political rhetoric. Political rhetoric will always try to inflame the language identities of the dominant group and so on. But at the grassroots level, people learn languages that are functional. It's not like learning language as an ideological stand. Learning languages as a functional process. In this country, people have been going from one end to the other. Professor Patnaik has written severally about it, going from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, and the same group of people being able to communicate. So you draw, I think his own writing, you draw lines across 5 kilometers, you would see the continuity there. It's not that, one language would just suddenly disappear and all that. So that continuity is there in the how people use languages. So I think political rhetoric is a different ball game altogether. When it comes to a child in the classroom, we know, the teacher knows at least what are the languages he is capable of using. And that is important.
Thank you, sir. I had seen Anand Singh raising his hand. Anand, you can go ahead and ask a question. Anand, are you there? Okay, in the meantime, okay, he has posted in the chat. Anand is asking, why do we call English L2 in the Indian context, where a learner is exposed to 2 or more languages before learning English? English, why not an additional language? Why it is called L2 in Indian context and not an additional language? Anyone can respond, maybe Jim
I
Cummins.
didn't know Minati would be able to address this.
That's
I
political.
didn't know that English is L2. I still don't figure out why should English be L2. I don't know. For some people, English is L1. That is a different thing altogether. But I don't know. Minati would be able to reflect on that.
No, I think in various avatar of 3 language formula, English has taken first or second or third position, So English is not necessarily L2, but yes, it is in most cases L2, like Odia, and then we transit to English, Bengali to English. So, 8 scheduled languages tend to become L1 and English becomes L2. Yeah, but it's not, it's natural. It's not natural. It's naturalized in the context of our politics, language politics. Yeah, L2, no, I mean, English takes various position.
So, next question is from Vandana Singh. She's asking, can you please share how multilingualism and diversity can be applied or seen in context of educational process of government schools in Delhi in India?
I missed that one. Minati, can you take it up?
Read out again, even I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. Can you please share how multilingualism and diversity can be applied or seen in context of educational processes of government schools in Delhi in India? It's kind of a general question. How you see diversity and multilingualism going together in government
The
schools?
presentations were addressing this question.
Okay.
But do you want to take this up separately?
The NCF, actually, the curricular framework for language teaching does address this question. Does address this question. And then we are trying to, in NCRT, try to develop a specific position paper on language education. We are trying to deal with that kind of question. So diversity is part of the system. It's not just ideological concept, but it's part of the system. A child is aware of the diversity. This is what our language socialization work shows, that by the time the child goes to school, child is aware, and Minati's work, the field study in language contact areas in Rajasthan and other places, she shows that children are all aware of this. They know, for example, when they go to a marketplace, they would use a language which is slightly different, and then when they go to another context, they will use a language which is slightly different. So they know their mother tongue. They know how languages should, use of language will change from one situation to the other. There's primary grade children. I'm not talking about CISOs. Adults do it also, but primary grade children are also aware. Grade 3, for example, a child is aware of the diversity.
The diversity, of course, challenges us. Like our classrooms are too diverse. Sometimes we have 15, 20 languages, but those challenges therefore have to be seen as, actually many have talked about how linguistic diversity can only be a resource and a better resource for a multilingual
Yes,
classroom.
yes.
Both teaching languages and also non-language subjects where language becomes a kind of mediator. So multiple languages are resources in our context, which requires a different kind of pedagogic imagination. And we can address them pedagogically very well. And of course, the identities are to be respected and included in those pedagogies. But yes, I mean, we don't get intimidated by the diversity, linguistic diversity of our classrooms. We rather need to be more imaginative, more creative to address it pedagogically. I think that would be our answer. And people are doing, different scholars in India are actually addressing it pedagogically. More questions. Varsa, maybe another 3 questions and not more.
Yeah, I think we'll wind up, and maybe since Jim has been participating and overhearing our conversation about Indian situation and the complexity, I would request him to sort of briefly reflect on that kind of situation at the end. Maybe two, 3 more questions, and then we start winding up.
Yeah, for the document that we are working on, we are engaging with several consultations, and this is one of such consultation that we were planning to have. But then we'll also get back to you individually, and we'll also have more such lectures or dialogues in future to help us develop this document. So some of the questions that we don't take up today, we will take up in our next lectures. You can also write directly to our speakers who can.
No, what I think I would request Varsa to put all the questions together and send it across to maybe Jim, myself, and Minati, and then we'll see. We can respond to those questions, and maybe you can post it subsequently in some forum or someplace.
Okay, let's then take one last question and then request Jim to reflect. Yeah.
There are some comments. Jayanta has asked a question. Can multilingualism be incorporated into teaching literature to students studying English majors at higher education in Odisha? What is the rationale?
Actually, Jim has worked since 2007 on teaching English in using mother tongues. That's the problem with our English teachers and English teaching. We assume that English teaching has to be only in English. Whereas the actual context in which languages are used, the English, Hindi, everything goes together. In a recent work, I have shown a large number of English words which are present in the daily vocabulary in the tribal areas. Tribal child doesn't know that this is English. She treats this language, these words like pen, table, chair, you name any large number of those languages. She thinks it's a part of her language. Only later when she would learn English, she would discover that this is also a word in English. So therefore, let us not bother about that monolingual instructional strategy. Jim has written about it, treating languages as solitude. I think we need to get over that. We need to rethink our English teaching strategy. I have some papers for ELT, the English language teachers and all that, where this is what I have been trying to propose, that let us not take our English classroom only as a sanctified system where only English is to be used. All languages can be brought together, and the use of mother tongue is a great pedagogic aid to clarifying many of these concepts, including grammatical concepts and all that in English and other languages. So therefore, this is very well established all over the world. Unfortunately, in India, our English pedagogues have not come to that the terms, and have not developed the strategy of using mother tongue systematically, I think little more systematically to facilitate teaching of English, but that is necessary.
Thank you, sir.
Jim,
Thank you.
would you like to reflect on some of the questions that you heard?
Okay. It's obviously been a really rich conversation, and what was going through my mind as we were talking was when we talk about notions like linguistic human rights and associate that with children's mother tongues. That's a fairly abstract concept for a lot of teachers, for a lot of parents, for policymakers. It certainly fits in with the social justice perspective, but we've got to ask, like, what does this mean practically in the context of a hugely complex society, schools that reflect that complexity, both linguistically, culturally, and in multiple other ways. And there are some very concrete principles that I think reflect the same notion as linguistic human rights, but do it in a way that are probably much more comprehensible and concrete for educators, parents, and others. And one of them is the notion of connecting to students' lives. If you were to ask a large majority of teachers in probably most countries around the world, do you think that curriculum should connect up with students' lives? Should they be able to connect it with their experience? I think most teachers would say, yeah, of course. They're going to learn much more if we connect up with what we already know. And that's activating prior knowledge, connecting with students' lives is a common sense notion that is totally supported by a large variety of research going back to the 1930s and the work of Frederick Bartlett. And so if we accept that notion of schools and teachers correcting curriculum, correcting pedagogy with students' lives, then there's a huge and obvious contradiction to say, yes, we should be connecting with students' lives, but in practice, we're telling students, leave your languages at the schoolhouse door because they don't belong here. Students' experiences that they've grown up with are encoded in those languages. And as Ajit has pointed out, these languages may be multiple and contextualized based on the student's experience of using different languages in different contexts, even before they come to school. But you cannot connect instruction with students' lives. You cannot build on, as you're pointing out, Mohanty, the funds of knowledge that communities have, unless you also acknowledge that students' languages are important. And so from a pedagogical point of view, from a common sense point of view, I think that's a useful first principle to start off with. And then how that is going to look is going to vary from one situation to another, from one teacher to another. But the starting point has got to be to say that, yes, teachers in India, across India, and teachers in many other parts of the world are beginning to explore in really creative ways, ways of building on the funds of knowledge that children bring to school, not just the cultural or experiential funds of knowledge, but also the linguistic funds of knowledge. And this allows also for greater parental involvement, which is something that, again, we know is important. And so translating relatively abstract notions like linguistic human rights into the concrete reality of what happens in classrooms and the mindset that teachers bring into the classroom. If they have that mindset, it opens up pedagogical doors, and teacher creativity and teachers' collective creativity within a school, whether it's in Delhi or some very rural tribal area, will come up with creative solutions that match their situations, and we can build on those solutions. So again, it goes back to two notions. One is teachers as knowledge generators, and when you articulate that notion, you're saying something really important to teachers. Your job is not just to take a curriculum that somebody else has written in some place outside of this local community and then transmit that curriculum to students. Your job is to be creative, to address the complexity of the classroom in all its manifestations, and to come up with creative ways of building on the potential that every child brings into the classroom, and that includes linguistic potential. And then, so the notion of teachers as knowledge generators is a statement regarding teacher identity and teacher potential identity. And it's much more empowering for teachers to see themselves in that way, compared to the notion that teachers' job is to transmit the curriculum that somebody in Delhi or some researcher in some university has said they should be teaching, which is outside of their experience, outside of children's experience. And then the other principle that's relevant here is from a research point of view and from a policy point of view. And I've tried to express that very simply as actuality implies possibility. If something has happened, if teachers have innovated in this particular way, that implies that this is possible. If it has happened, it can happen. And this totally undercuts the mindset that a lot of teachers in many countries that are characterized by linguistic diversity have, but to say, well, there's 5 different languages, there's 10 different languages in my classroom, I don't know any of these languages, so there's nothing I can do in this situation to help teach students languages. The reality is there's a huge amount, and we have the experiential and instructional data to show it. And these situations have been documented through case studies around the world, ranging from Ireland to Canada to India to many other countries. And so if that has happened, then we can say, well, if it has happened, it can happen. Actuality implies possibility, and it'll look different in our situation as we bring our creativity as educators to it. So those two notions, I think, teachers as knowledge generators and actuality implies possibility, are worth keeping in mind at the same time as ways of addressing the fundamental principle that that curriculum and instruction should connect to students' lives.
Thank you, Jim. Also, we have developed a structure of this document that's still, undergoing a revision. Can I send to you and Professor Mohanty to have a look and suggest?
Sure.
Those are
Yes.
more sub-themes kind under different chapters. I
Yeah,
will
sure,
send to you and Professor Mohanty for comments. Varsa, shall we wind up now? Rahul, are you around?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Yeah, Rahul is working with us on this book document. So Rahul is a linguist again from JNU, but is now working with IGNCA. Would you like to extend a word of thanks to everybody?
Thank you, ma'am. I sincerely thank Professor Jim Cummins and Professor Ajit Mohanty for this insightful and deeply enriching dialogue on the critical role of multilingual education and the importance of mother tongue-based education. My heartfelt gratitude also goes to Dr. Huma Masood and to Professor Minity Panda, whose efforts and guidance made this important conversation possible. Thank you all for being a part of this dialogue and for your continued commitment to advancing inclusive and equitable education. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Jim, for
Bye.
being here.
Professor
Good to
Mohanty,
see
bye,
Good to be
you.
here.
Professor Cummins.
Okay.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much for joining us today. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
See you in the next
Bye.
lecture.
Yeah, we'll
Bye.
be in touch. Bye, Giridhar.
Bye.